follow up. All right, so welcome everyone. Just for people who were not here last week, just a word of reassurance that we are not relying on any background from last week for what we're talking about this week. There's some sources in common, obviously, when we talk about Jewish medical ethics, and I'll go over those sort of basic values again. But these classes are meant to be able to drop into and not build on each other. I sent out an email yesterday that had a link to the recording and the text sheets from last week. So if people would missed it and would like to go back and see what we did, they're welcome to do that. And just a word of, I did not say this formally last time, so I want to just let people know I will be recording this as a video also for people who missed it. I'm only distributing it internally. It's only going out to Bethel mailing list, so it's not publicly visible on the internet for someone who doesn't have the link. But just wanted to give people some fair warning about that in case they are uncomfortable, being on video. Just wanted to let you know about that right up front. Okay, so welcome everyone. So last week, we decided that we were going to be talking about organ donation in Jewish tradition today. And the more I worked on this and the more I researched it, the more I realized it is a huge topic. So we're going to do a sort of overview today. And what we may wind up doing is identify areas that we will sort of touch on, explore a little bit, but perhaps then revisit in greater depth another time, because I did want to sort of give a survey of all of the sort of varieties and of sort of the whole area of organ donation, because there are at least two big areas that differ from each other pretty substantially. So before I start talking, I want to get a sense of from people about what your experience, what your knowledge is, or what you've heard about, or what you think Judaism says about donating organs. Whether you think it's right or not, whether you agree with it or not. Just what are some ideas out there that you've heard? And I'll ask about two different kinds. One of them is donating organs after death. So signing an organ donor card, giving organs after death. And the second is about donating while you're alive, like giving a kidney. So I'll open it up. If anyone has, you can either speak, or if you'd like to type in the chat, I'd just love to hear what people's sort of pre-existing knowledge or what they've heard coming into this.
I had heard that Jews weren't supposed to have autopsies and weren't supposed to donate. I had heard that in sort of Orthodox type circles. I don't know if it's true for conservative.
Okay, so the issues about autopsies and similarly about donating organs. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Other things that people have heard?
Okay, this is Miriam.
Okay.
I've heard from the left and the right of Judaism that you are free to donate organs because of pikuach nefesh, to preserve life. And I've also heard that you mustn't do that because the body has to be returned to the maker the way it was given to you.
Okay, so you've heard both from varieties from both circles. I've seen Muriel saying donating to save a life is a good thing. Okay, other things that people have heard or experience or background?
Can't donate. You're not supposed to. Actually, if you lose something, you're supposed to bury it. No.
Okay, so is that Suzanne? Okay.
Yeah. Who else?
I don't know. Someone else might have the accent. I'm not sure. Everyone's cameras on. So you're saying that you're supposed to sort of keep body integrity intact when you're burying someone, right?
That's what I was taught. Yeah.
Yep.
This is Wilma. The latest I've heard is that it is okay to donate your organs, even though I know in the past you couldn't because you had to bury the body whole or as whole as it could be.
Right.
But I've heard now, and what I asked last week, I've heard now that it's okay to donate organs, and it's even okay for cremation.
Okay, cremation is a separate.
We're not talking about, but those were
burning.
related. things I heard.
Thank you.
What I've heard, actually, I've studied with the Rabbi Elliot Dorf, but this is a modern problem. It used to be years ago, donation was not an issue because you couldn't preserve the body long enough to donate it. So it's really a modern issue. But the Pikuah Nefesh, which is what Miriam talked about, is really, my understanding is why you considered it's still a personal decision. There's no decree that you have to do it. There's nothing wrong. But if, it's more a personal thing, the conservative movement supports it. The Orthodox don't talk about it, is my understanding.
Mhm. Okay. One or two more, and then any other, Howard?
Yes, I have heard within ultra-Orthodox circles that when Moshiach comes, all the dead will be resurrected. And when you're resurrected, you want to have all your working parts.
Right. Okay. One or two more? Anyone else? Okay, well, that kind of covers the gamut of things that I have heard, and so I wanted to dive into. Let's start, I think, with issues of let's start with issues of donating after death, and they're not, in some ways, donating, like giving a kidney, is less complicated in some ways and a little more complicated in other ways. But they present kind of different issues. So let me start with, and I actually have text sheets that are not quite done because there was so much material that I wound up dividing it into after death and living donations, and even those aren't quite finished yet. So I will send these out, but maybe a few days before I have them available, because I want to add some things to them before I make them public. But here, where's my screen share? Share screen. Okay, and I want my notes over here. Far too many windows here. Okay, so so first of all, we looked at these texts last week, but whoever mentioned, and Miriam and some other people all mentioned Pikuach Nefesh, about preserving human life, and that is absolutely a primary Jewish value, and in Jewish law, basically you are allowed to break any commandment except for the big three. In order to save a life. And the big three are basically murder, like kill him or I'll kill you. You're supposed to let yourself, you're not supposed to kill someone else even to preserve your own life. Forced, sexual immorality, rape that person, or commit incest or else I'll kill you. You're supposed to let yourself be killed. And then that last is idol worship and idolatry. That being worship this idol. This is sort of the Hanukkah story, right? Or else I'll kill you. So those are the big three. But anything else in Jewish law, saving a life supersedes it. You see that in even in the most ultra-Orthodox circles. I mean, that's why you have ambulances that run on Shabbat. That's why you have the hospitals still running in Israel. That's why sometimes you try to do workarounds to make sure that things that aren't essential to life-saving can be done in a different way. I know, for example, that like Orthodox hospitals in Israel on Shabbat, you might have a different way of recording stuff or writing that's not sort of technically writing by halakha, because the writing isn't exactly life-saving, but you keep records. But at any rate, one of the core texts for this is of this Pikuach Nefesh, saving lives overriding anything else, is from this text from Leviticus, where it says, "Ushmatem et chukotai vet mishpatai," shall keep my laws and my rules, asher yaseh otam ha'adam v'chai behem, by the pursuit of which a person shall live. I am God. And the Talmud and the Rabbinic Judaism basically takes that and says, "V'chai behem below sheyamut behem," you should live by them and not die by them. So the idea the commandments are there in the service of life, and not that except for those big three, that you should sacrifice yourself to keep any of the commandments. So so the one piece is that's about Pikuach Nefesh, about saving lives, overriding just about any piece of Jewish law. And where do we get the idea that we have a duty to step in and save someone? I mean, yes, maybe that means that I shouldn't endanger myself by keeping Shabbat, in a way that might, not, jump onto the helicopter rescuing me from the flooding roof because Shabbat. But what about rescuing other people? So we looked at this text last week as well about lo ta'amod al dam re'echa, do not stand idly by the blood of your neighbor. And that gets sort of elaborated in later Jewish law into a duty to intervene when someone is in danger, even physically intervene. In the Talmud in Sanhedrin, it talks about someone who sees someone else drowning in a river or being dragged away by a wild animal or being attacked by bandits. Why are you obligated to save them? Because of this verse in Leviticus that you shall not stand idly by the blood of another. And then, that might be, okay, so if you're a surgeon or if you're a doctor, maybe that obligates you to personally save someone if you have that ability. But what about, more distant connection? What if am I obligated to, there's a big stretch between saving someone from a bandit and, doing an organ after death. So one piece of it is that there's another, there's also that this applies not only to saving someone's life, but also saving someone from being maimed or seriously injured. And that actually comes from the text about the commandment to return lost objects to their rightful owner. And the Talmud, I'm not going to get into all of the logic, but the Talmud basically says that applies not only to returning someone's like lost donkey to them, but also making them whole in a very physical sense. That saving a limb, saving their health, also comes under the that rubric of restoring to other people and standing idly by the blood of another. And sort of in Talmudic logic, again, I'm not going to get into this because this gets into sort of the Talmud's sense of, well, if we would have, what is this extra thing does this text come to tell us because there's no repetition in the Bible according to the Talmud. But the Talmud and later Maimonides say that not only are you personally obligated to save someone, but you also have to mobilize your resources too. That say, if I can't swim, but I see some guy standing nearby who can swim, I say, hey, I'll give you $30. Go, please go out there and save this person. That you're obligated to save a life, to give up your resources, and not just physically do something. If you can't do it, but you can make it happen through what's available to you, then you're required to do that. And then this is Maimonides later on codifying it. So this is 11th century. I always get the dates wrong. So he's sort of takes this and distills it down and says, someone who can save another's life and doesn't do so, whether they can do it by themselves or they can hire other people to do it and they don't do so, they've broken this commandment about standing idly by the blood of your neighbor. So all of this would seem to be really good reasons to be giving life-saving organ donations to save lives. And what doesn't that include? So that wouldn't include something like giving tissue for cosmetic surgery. It wouldn't necessarily include giving your body for sort of scientific research that won't help any particular person. This is really about life saving, and mostly when we talk about organ donation, we're talking about saving lives. We're talking about hearts, kidneys, livers, lungs, pancreases. Corneas are an interesting case because that's another thing we can transplant is cornea to save someone's vision. And there's actually a provision in Jewish law that basically talks about how being blind is so dangerous, and that someone who's blind is almost considered as if they're dead because they're basically in constant hazard, that saving someone's vision is considered to be almost on the level of saving life. So all of these are sort of way on the side of the scale of yes, but then there are the other things that people mention on the other side of the scale. Now let me just take a look at my notes. Okay, so one obvious one that people talked about quite a bit is respect for the integrity of a body, right? That we, you know, we treat the dead with respect in Judaism. You know, we wash someone after they die, we stay with them, we guard them, we accompany them to their final resting place. You know, we bury them, and we do it, you know, a way that preserves, that respects them as you know, a being created in God's image. You know, not physically, but that, you know, our bodies are holy, and you know, they're considered to be a gift, and they're, you don't you don't defile bodies in for needless ways. And there's the one piece of this actually comes, believe it or not, from laws of capital punishment in the Bible, that about burying a criminal who's been executed the same day, because to not do so is considered to be sort of a defilement. That even and that, sort of in Talmudic logic, okay, you treat a criminal with respect, obviously you treat everyone else with respect. That everyone's, you know, body needs to be treated with respect because they're created in God's image, no matter who they are. There are also issues in terms of so that's just about respect and about sort of a general reluctance to do anything to bodies, but to let them be buried whole. Then there's the issue of delaying burial, because, you know, in Jewish tradition we know that we ideally bury within a day, and sometimes it's delayed. And sort of the general the Jewish law about it is that you are allowed to delay burial if you do it for the sake of the person's honor. So, for example, relatives, you need time for relatives to arrive, or you need time to get a coffin or burial shrouds, or to assemble people together for the funeral, you're allowed to delay burial. So the delay of burial it's not an absolute prohibition. It's about whether it's being done in a way that dishonors the dead or a way that honors them. And then there's another, there's another factor in Jewish law about benefiting from the dead. And I'm not even going to get into the details of this piece of Talmud, but basically, just like you're not supposed to benefit, for example, from idolatry, you're also not supposed to benefit materially from the dead. So I guess one place where this would, I don't have great examples of this that are not really distasteful, but you know, certainly like, I don't know if people have heard about some of these museum exhibits where they take dead bodies and do some sort of plasticization treatment and as sort of an educational display. Certainly, like, being involved in that sort of on the business end would be forbidden. And you know, you can really argue that as Jews we probably should not be patronizing that kind of thing either. That there's a fundamental there's a difference between sort of medical education on the one hand, which means you're training doctors to to be able to heal, and that's, you know, maybe more justifiable. But for the sake of spectacle in a museum, there's something really very disturbing about that. But at any rate, so the question about benefiting from the dead in terms of organ donation, you could say, well, isn't this benefiting? You know, you're taking something from a body and using it to help someone else. Is that a problem? So in all of the cases, you know, actually, let me go to one more piece, which is the issue about sort of folk beliefs about burials and bodily integrity. So we know that you know, for example, when someone dies, we do tahara, we wash the body, do this sort of purification. Some people worry that what happens if, you know, after a procedure to remove organs for transplant, maybe you can't do that. Does that you know, stand in the way of transplant? There's a question that some people have about, if someone's body isn't complete, are they allowed to be buried in a Jewish cemetery? And there are questions, as someone mentioned, about resurrection. There's the belief that, you know, Mashiach is going to come and resurrect the dead, and, you know, what if they're missing their heart? What then? So right. So one thing to be really clear about in terms of burial in a Jewish cemetery is, this happens all the time. The ideal is to bury all of someone, but, you know, soldiers in war all the time, you don't necessarily have all of their body parts. Think about the Holocaust. You know, no one would say that, you know, you can't, that somehow they're actually that's not a perfect example, but there are all kinds of situations where you're unable to bury all of someone, and that doesn't mean that the burial wasn't valid, or there's you do the best you can. The question is whether doing this is worth it, which we'll get to in a second. And the last question is about resurrection of the dead. And Saadia Gaon in the 9th century, actually 900s, 10th century, who lived in Babylonia, he had a book called the Book of Doctrines and Beliefs about resurrection of the dead. And he was making an argument for this idea of resurrection. And he said, we know of no Jew who opposes this doctrine or finds it difficult from the perspective of reason that God could revive the dead. It's already clear that God created the world ex nihilo, out of nothing. So then he can therefore find no difficulty that God should, by a second act, create something from something disintegrated and dissolved. So basically the logic is, he knew when you die and you're buried, there is not much left but bones very quickly. And if you believe that God is going to bodily resurrect people, God shouldn't really have a problem in restoring pieces of a body that aren't there anymore, because everything isn't there anymore. It has all become one with the earth. So it's definitely a folk belief, and it's very understandable. There's an extreme emotional resistance to intervening with the departed. But the question, as Bernie said, this is a very modern question. This was not something that Jewish law developed knowing about, because until the mid 20th century, this wasn't even a possibility. The idea that by modifying funeral practices, or by delaying burial, or by disturbing the integrity of a body, you could save lives. That's new. That's a very new thing. So what do you do with that? And basically, the overwhelming mainstream opinion in Jewish law is that, just like I said at the beginning, that if you are saving life by doing transplants from someone who has died, that overrides every other provision of Jewish law except for the big three, except for murder, sexual immorality, or idolatry. So there are all kinds of things you set aside to save a life, and this all falls into that category. This is pretty universal. We're going to get into in a second what some of the complications are, and actually on a practical level. But yeah, it's the idea that you can save a life by delaying burial. Remember, it talked about you're allowed to delay burial for the honor of a person. What greater honor can there be? And this is sort of the mainstream Orthodox take on this. What greater honor can there be than to save a life? That if you're allowed to delay a burial so that you can get a coffin or shrouds, how much more should you be able to delay a burial so that, particularly if they've chosen to do this before they died, that this final wish of the deceased can happen, and they can save a life through their death. The same goes for sort of the integrity of a corpse. Again, there's actually a really disturbing tshuva I read from the Holocaust, in which there was a rabbi during the Holocaust who basically said he saw a pregnant woman executed in front of him, and he said, absolutely, we should do an emergency C-section, try to rescue the fetus, not knowing even whether it's viable or not, because saving a life, even in that very direct brutal way, here's someone who was just murdered and trying to save the baby, and thereby sort of defacing the dead, was absolutely worthwhile in order for even the possibility of saving the life. So that's that's a horrible example and a horrible precedent, but that's the overriding value, is that saving lives overrides most other factors. So like some people ask the question of, okay, so what are you supposed to do if a body's supposed to all be buried together? What do you do? Okay, now this heart or this kidney is with someone else. What then? one piece of thinking about it, which I think find a little strange, but actually makes sense on some level, is, that organ is no longer dead. It's been restored to life, and so you're burying all of the dead person that remains dead, and when the recipient eventually dies, that will be buried too, God willing. But that's whether or not it is, if it's used to save a life, it's absolutely overrides the consideration of the integrity of the body. And the rabbi, this Rabbi Unterman from this, who was a former chief rabbi of Israel, actually makes the analogy that it's like giving blood, because we know that, and we've seen this, that after suicide bombings and things like that, you're supposed to be buried with your blood, but that doesn't stand in the way of donating blood to someone who can benefit from it. So it's not an exact analogy, but if it's supporting someone else's life, that's the most important thing. And there's the quote, the quote from that Israeli rabbi's tshuva is, "In the chadarvash omed bifnei pikuach nefesh." There's nothing that stands in the way of saving lives. You shouldn't even be sort of fishing for reasons. That being said, a lot of the sort of Orthodox writing around this is very sympathetic to the emotional toll of making this decision, and says that making the decision can be really heart-wrenching, and it's really difficult, and particularly since it's such a new situation, and most of Orthodoxy will not say that you're required to be an organ donor. The interesting thing is the conservative movement actually has gone a little bit further. There is, let me stop this for a second. I just realized I'm not sharing. There is a response from the conservative movement. Let's see, I have it in one of my infinite number of windows that are open here. Let's see. All right, I seem to have closed that window for right now. I'll have to dig it up, and I'll post the link afterwards. It's available on the Rabbinical Assembly's website. But they basically went a little bit further, and then they essentially said that it's not only, I mean, they're not going so far as to say that let me put it this way. They basically say that it's a mitzvah, but it's not a chovah, meaning that it can't be enforced, because actually, I'm sorry, I'm confusing the living donation and postmortem donation. But in the Orthodox world, they're basically sort of walking a line. They're saying it's a incredibly generous thing to do. It's a mitzvah. It's not something that can be enforced in the same way that tzedakah is a mitzvah, but you can't necessarily enforce any particular act of tzedakah on someone. You can't say, well, these $10 you should have given, and if you didn't give them, you've broken the mitzvah of tzedakah. In the same way, in Orthodoxy, they'll basically say that this is again, there's some issues that I'll do within a second about when death is, and then what defines what the heart and breathing and defining death versus brain death. We'll talk about that in a second. I see now there are a bunch of things in the chat. I'll respond to those in a second. In the conservative movement, they actually went a little bit further, and they're basically saying that post-mortem organ donation is a mitzvah, that people should be organ donors. They should sign up for it. The rabbis should be teaching it, and rabbis who don't teach their communities about it are in some way complicit in the loss of life. It was a very powerful tshuva, again, with the caveat being that it is after death and that it is for life-saving purposes. So let's see. So let me look at the questions that have accumulated while I didn't have that window open. So Karen, you asked about using organs being benefiting from the dead. Yeah, it would be. But there's a difference between benefiting sort of a financial point of view and saving life. And again, saving life overrides the technical prohibition of benefiting from the dead. Even if the doctors are making money, the hospitals are benefiting. That the whole point is, doctors are also allowed to charge for for their services. But yeah, the saving life. So Mary, you asked about donating one's body. Yeah, donating one's body to medical research. That actually gets back to a question someone raised right at the beginning about autopsy, and that is not new. There has been the question of autopsy, especially autopsy required by the civil authorities, going way back in Jewish life. Very often, going back centuries, if there's, for instance, a suspicious death or a suspected murder, the government will want to do an autopsy to see whether there's criminal activity involved, and that's been a real issue in Judaism. The mainstream traditional position about autopsy has been you can do it if it's going to save or potentially save a particular person's life. So the example, the obvious example right now is you have this new pandemic, right? You have someone in the hospital who's died, you're trying to figure out what's going on. In that kind of case, when there are specific people you can point to who will benefit from the knowledge gained by that autopsy, you are absolutely allowed to, and in fact required to do it. The question then becomes, what if it's sort of more abstract knowledge? Maybe there's not a particular person who's sick. Maybe you just know somewhere one might learn something from this particular autopsy. Like it'll benefit someone maybe, but there's no guarantee, or it's much more distant or disconnected, and things get much more iffy in that way. One thing I found fascinating, this was the same rabbi, I believe, this Israeli chief rabbi from mid 20th century, actually said that if you have an autopsy that's required by the civil authorities and would be problematic by Jewish law, that one way to make it okay would be to also combine it with organ donation. That if an autopsy is going to be done whether you want it to be or not, that if you can make sure that this disturbance of the body is also saving a life, that mitigates the problem with the autopsy. Then that's not sort of, it's disrespect for the purpose of saving lives and not just for a criminal investigation or whatever. I thought that was fascinating. It's kind of a chilling example, but he really did think that even if some kinds of autopsies could be problematic, that the overriding importance of saving life through organ donation was not only important on its own, but could actually sort of redeem a autopsy that otherwise wouldn't be happening. Okay, so amputations. Amputations, again, if they're medically necessary, absolutely. There's no prohibition of medically necessary procedures, even if they harm you. That's actually not an unreasonable question, because in Jewish law there is an entire strand about not only are you forbidden to physically harm other people, but you're forbidden from self-harm, because sort of the fundamental theology is that our bodies are not entirely ours, that they're gifts from God, and that we have responsibilities for self-care. And so irrational or unmotivated self-injury is actually a violation of Jewish law. And then there's a lot of sort of legal argumentation about what the parameters of medical care are. But it's pretty clear. It's pretty clear Jewishly that if you're talking about something that's necessary for life or significant health function, that absolutely. So amputation is a similar issue in some ways to surgery. You do surgery on someone, you're cutting them. There's actually, believe it or not, I've seen technical discussions about, if you're in the Orthodox world, if you're a surgeon and your father comes in as a patient, there's a specific prohibition against injuring a parent, apart from the general prohibition of injuring someone. So there's some questions about, maybe you shouldn't be doing surgery on a parent, because whatever the other motivations are, that there's kind of a double prohibition against against injuring a parent. And so maybe you need someone else to do the surgery on a parent because of that issue. Okay, let's see. Bernie, that is a great question. If you're obligated to do whatever you have to do to save a life, or you're obligated to donate a kidney if anyone needs one? That is a wonderful question. I have not yet gotten to live donations because, and that is I think we'll just be able to touch on that a little bit today. And we may have to return to it next time. But there are a whole other set of constraints that come into, or considerations that come into play when we're talking about risk to you as the donor. That one of the things about donating after death is you're not endangering your health, right? By definition, it's happening only after you're gone, and so there are questions about treatment of the dead, but there are not questions about whether you're endangering yourself by donating, or are there? And that's the last thing I want to look at, which was what is the definition of death in Judaism? Because we know that for some organ donations, like corneas, they can be taken and used substantially after someone has died. But there are certain donations, like the heart, for example, that a minute or two of not having oxygen and they begin to die. And again, as Bernie said, this is a question of modern technology. This was not something that would ever have come up. But what is the definition of death in Judaism? And if someone is being kept, their heart and lungs are kept working on a ventilator, but they're brain dead, what are the factors at play there? And there is, I will tell you right up front, I have a source to share, and I do not have time to get the sort of follow-up modern sources. I'll try to do that before I make this into something I share with everyone. But let's see, share screen. So the classic definition of death in Judaism is if they're breathing, and possibly heartbeat. This is from the Talmud, so this is 1,500 years ago or so. And the question is basically about if a building collapses, that's on Shabbat or a holiday. How do you determine? I mean, obviously you need to try to rescue people, but how do you know if they're actually dead or not? What do you? At some point, like if someone is dead, you're supposed to leave the disaster scene until after the holiday or Shabbat is over. But if you can save a life, obviously you keep digging. And so the question is, if someone's caught under a collapsed building, until what point do you check to see if they're still alive? And the sort of rabbinic discussion about is about until you can see if they're breathing. And some people say until you check their heart. But basically they're saying, well, if you're like recovering the person from below, do you check the heartbeat, or do you wait till you can see if they're breathing from their nose or not? But basically, breath seems to be the take-home message. That if someone is breathing, then they are considered to be alive according to Jewish tradition, and the heartbeat is sort of considered to go along with that. That if you're not breathing, your heart isn't beating either, and we know that's very closely linked in time. And if you're not breathing, then that is sort of the classic definition of death. Hang on, let me unshare that. So let's see. I'm sorry. Someone raised their hand. Was it? If you raise your hand, can you please go ahead and? I saw the notification go by and it disappeared. Okay, never mind. So the question is, what about brain death? And one thing I learned is that brain death as a medical criterion was not really finalized and accepted until the late 60s in the world. That there was a great deal of controversy. What is brain death? Brain death, and I'm not a doctor, and I know there are people with more medical background than I am here, but my understanding is that brain death is basically when the not only the the main part of the brain, but the brainstem, the part that supports basic vital functions like breathing, has no electrical activity whatsoever, and that it's a flatline EEG, and that it is it seems to be irretrievably so, that it's not something that comes back. that is considered to be sort of in the medical community a definition of death. The question in Jewish law then becomes what we also know that someone can stop breathing and their heart can stop and they can be revived. So the question about like mechanical ventilation is if someone is on a machine that is breathing for them and moving air in and out of their lungs, and their heart keeps beating in order to recirculate the blood. If someone is brain dead, if you turn the machine off, then someone who's brain dead, that breath and heartbeat will cease. And so the was become sort of the consensus take in Jewish tradition of whichever part of the spectrum you're on, whether you sort of accept brain death or not, is that if there were no ventilator involved, and if someone stops breathing and is not cannot no longer maintain breath or heartbeat on their own, that's considered to be death. And the question with brain death is, can you reasonably assume that if someone is brain dead, that essentially they are parts of their body are being kept functional, but the brain death is a signal that they are not capable of breathing and their heart beating on their own. So there has been a huge controversy in the Jewish world for the past 50 years or so about that. And I was researching it, and it's to the point where major legal authorities, after they die, their disciples are arguing about did he say that? No, he didn't say that. He said it, but he didn't want to write it down. Like there were major controversies. But what's basically the consensus position is that of modern Orthodoxy and conservative Judaism is that they do accept irreversible brain death as a indication that someone is dead, and that at that point you are sort of keeping organs oxygenated, but you're not really keeping them alive. And there may even be an argument to be made that once someone is brain dead, that by keeping them on a ventilator, you're actually sort of delaying burial. So we'll talk. I think probably next time we'll talk more about sort of end of life decision making and the decision of when and if it's okay to say discontinue life support, because that is a complex question. But most of the non-ultra-Orthodox world accepts brain death as a criterion for when someone is actually dead. There's some parts of the Orthodox world and ultra-Orthodox world that don't. And then there's an issue in terms of certain people in certain Jewish communities deciding whether it's okay to sign up to be an organ donor. That being said, there's actually there is a Orthodox group called the Halakhic Organ Donor Society that is out there basically urging people to register for organ donation. They have a special organ donor card that people in concert with their rabbi in the Orthodox world can say, here are the conditions under which I'm willing to be a donor. And so they can see if their community does not accept brain death, they'll say they can say, I need to be unable to maintain respiration on my own, and you may not sort of turn off a ventilator, keep me on a ventilator until it's time to do the transplant. But yeah, there's more to say about this, and I do not have time to get into sort of the ins and outs and the details of it. But that is sort of the big in the Orthodox world. That is the dividing line as to whether yes, okay, that's a great question. Jane Les just asked, is there any problem accepting organs? And there isn't. And so that raises a question of sort of equity and justice. Are you saying that you're not okay donating organs, but you're fine with accepting them from someone who may have been on a ventilator until brain dead and on a ventilator until the moment that kidney or heart or whatever was harvested? And that is one of the reasons why there's been this push in the Orthodox community to really the rate of organ donation in the Orthodox community, both for these reasons about life support and also for the sort of beliefs about a burial and about treatment of bodies. The legal position in all of the Orthodox world is that it's a mitzvah to save lives through organ donation. The folk believes in sort of the emotional realities of it can be really different, and the rate of organ donation, particularly in the Orthodox community, has been rather low, and that's part of the reason why there's been this drive to sort of educate and have rabbis out there advocating for it and saying, either you should sign your organ donor card completely, or you should sign the sort of special case version of it, because saving life is such an important thing. But yeah, I agree, Jane and Les, that there is certainly a ethical and moral, and frankly also sort of an appearance, a Marit Ayin and a Chilul Hashem, a concern about doing something that seems morally reprehensible to people. To say, well, my community won't give organs, we'll accept them. Like that's to be very blunt. It's gross, and it feels unethical, and that is one of the many reasons why the Orthodox community started making a push about this. Other questions? Because we're running short on time, but I think we'll probably have to turn to live donation issues like giving a kidney and things like that next week. We'll probably move on to we'll probably hit the some end of life issues next week as well. Let me take a look at my notes and see if there are any other.
Rabbi, can I jump in?
Please.
It's Miriam with a quick funny story. I think it's funny and quick. Anyway, when I was education director at Bethel, we got a call, and I was the only non-secretarial person in the building at the time. So the call was sent to me. A new grandfather, the bris had been at his house and in Poughkeepsie. And when the mohel, the circumciser, left, he left the foreskin. And the grandfather was calling to say, what am I supposed to do with this? And I had never heard of the mohel leaving the foreskin. I had no idea. So I said I would get back to him. And I called Rabbi Kay, who was then the very scholarly, very lovely rabbi at Shomrei Israel. Well, after he stopped laughing, he told me that he would have to get back to me because he wasn't sure. And soon after, he did get back to me. And his answer was, after his research, that it had to be buried. It could be buried in a flower pot. It could be buried in the backyard. It didn't have to be buried in sanctified ground, but it just had to be covered with dirt. And so I think the Pistoners asked whether an amputation has to be ceremonially buried. And if foreskin can be akin to an amputation, judiciously, that apparently it does not have to have a ceremony.
Yeah, I know that there is a practice sometimes of if someone who has amputation in the Orthodox community may have a burial plot already, and they will, if they have a burial plot already, they may choose to bury the amputated limb, in the place where the rest of them will eventually be buried. That's not always possible, but that's one thing I've heard of. Other questions as we sort of close for today? Any reactions? This is not easy material, but I'm curious whether anyone had anything that surprised them or disturbs them or that they're thinking about. So I want to close with, let's see, where is my notes on this? Yeah, so I will send out a link for sure to the Rabbinical Assembly's legal paper on this, and basically their take on at least post-mortem organ donation is that people should have organ donor cards. They should sign them. They should grant consent if they're asked. They're asked after a loved one's death. And one way that they say to think about it is that us as bereaved people are sort of agents and partners of our deceased loved one in that act of pikuach nefesh, that we're helping them do an act of pikuach nefesh of saving life on their behalf. We're kind of their proxy in making sure that their intention to do that actually happens. That there's no greater kavod hamet, no greater honor one can bring to the dead than bringing healing to the living. So that is certainly where the conservative movement winds up on this, is that at least as far as postmortem, as postmortem donations, that there are a mitzvah that you can't enforce it. No one's going to be coming around and saying, you have to sign this, but that it is strongly, strongly urged, and that it is rises to the level of moral obligation, even if it's not an enforceable legal obligation for us as Jews to be organ donors for the purpose of saving lives. Okay, thank you, everyone. So next week, we will, I think we will probably spend a little time on the issues of live donation, which are less fraught, but there are definitely issues about danger for sure. And then we'll be talking about end of life issues. We may spend more. Right now, next week is the last one we have scheduled. That will change. We may take a week break. I have to take a look at the calendar and see. But I know people are interested in end of life issues and decision making around end of life. There's a lot there where we certainly can't get to all of it next week. Rabbi Neil has also offered to come in and speak and answer questions about how when some of these theoretical issues meet the real world in his professional experience. He sits on the ethics committee at Vassar Brothers. He's on the board of the National Association of Jewish Chaplains. And he has a lot that he knows about how this works and the considerations involved. Let's see, when people say this, yeah, so also decisions about hospice and things like that, yeah. We may, we'll do some of that next week. I may defer some of that until Rabbi Neil is here. I have to confirm a time and date with him. All right, thank you, everyone, much appreciated. And if you have questions between now and next time, please feel free to email me. I'll see if I can dig up materials. And I will try to get this recording and source sheets out to folks, certainly before the next class. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Thank you, Rabbi. It was
My
very
pleasure.
good.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank
Everybody
you.
be safe and healthy.
Thank
Stay
you. Nice
warm.
to see everybody there.
Right. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank
Be
you.
well, everyone.